Imagine the suffocating, scorched air inside a silk tent, heavy with the scent of sandalwood, sweat, and fear. Outside, under the merciless Palestinian sun, lies a field strewn with the bodies of thousands of the finest knights in Christendom. It is the 4th of July, 1187, the day the history of the Crusades was fractured into before and after. In the center of this tent, in dazzling contrast to the surrounding slaughter, sits the Sultan Saladin, the embodiment of victory and chivalrous magnanimity. Before him, covered in dust, blood, and unspeakable humiliation, stands a prisoner. This is no mere knight. This is the King of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan. His lips are cracked from thirst, the very same thirst that doomed his army in the waterless desert near the horns of Hattin. Saladin, noticing this, makes a regal gesture and orders a cup of iced sherbet to be brought. For Guy, this is more than water. It is a symbol of Arab hospitality, a sign that his life will be spared. With trembling hands, he accepts the cup and, after taking a sip, passes it to another prisoner standing beside him, Reynald de Chatillon, the prince whose reckless raids were the formal cause of this war. In that instant, Saladin's face darkens. Through his interpreter, he speaks the ice-cold words, "I did not give drink to this wicked man." In this simple gesture lies the essence of the moment. Guy, the failed king, is saved not by his own valor, but by the ancient code of honor of his enemy. He is a passive object in a great game, a figure whose fate is decided by others. And in this very second, a paradox is born. The man who went down in history as the author of the Crusaders' greatest catastrophe stands on the verge of creating a dynasty that will outlive everyone present in this tent. How? How did this broken monarch, deprived of his kingdom and army, whose name became a synonym for defeat, manage to forge a 300-year legacy from the ashes of his humiliation? This question is the central mystery of his life, and the answer lies not in the strength of his sword, but in the winding paths of politics, luck, and astonishing, desperate persistence. To understand the origins of this incredible destiny, we must transport ourselves to the geopolitical chessboard that was the Holy Land at the end of the 12th century. This was not the monolithic world of a struggle between the cross and the crescent, as it is often portrayed, but a complex, vibrant organism, a patchwork quilt of warring interests. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the last bastion of the First Crusade, was less a mighty empire and more a fragile coastal strip of land, squeezed between the sea and the vast Muslim world. Within the kingdom itself, a cauldron of intrigue was boiling, one that would have done honor to the court of Constantinople. Power was divided between the king, whose authority was severely limited, and powerful baronial houses, the Ibelins, the Montferrats, the Chatillons, each pursuing its own agenda. Add to this two states within a state, the orders of the Templars and the Hospitallers. These military monastic organizations had their own armies, castles, and treasuries, answering directly to the Pope and often conducting their own foreign policy, which frequently clashed with that of the king. This internal fragmentation was overlaid with a complex system of international relations. The Crusaders formed alliances with some Muslim emirs against others, traded with Damascus and Cairo, and adopted elements of Eastern culture and life. A powerful peace party existed, led by local barons like Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, who were born in the Holy Land and understood the need for pragmatic coexistence with their neighbors. They were opposed by the war party, consisting mainly of newly arrived knights from the West, full of religious zeal and a thirst for glory, who neither understood nor accepted the fragile balance of power in the region. And over all this, the shadow of Saladin loomed like a gathering storm cloud. This Kurdish warlord had managed to do what no one before him had for a century. He had united Egypt and Syria under his rule, creating a single front against the Franks. He was not just a brilliant commander, but also a shrewd politician, patiently waiting for the moment when internal strife would finally weaken the kingdom of Jerusalem and allow him to strike a decisive blow. It was into this world, stretched taut like a string and ready to snap at any moment, that an unknown second son from the distant French region of Poitou arrived. Guy de Lusignan. He was not the cause of the coming catastrophe, but he became its catalyst, the spark that fell into the powder keg. A man's origin often defines his destiny, and in the case of Guy de Lusignan, this statement was steeped in mysticism and ill repute. The House of Lusignan from the county of Poitou in western France never belonged to the highest Capetian aristocracy. They were typical representatives of the robber barons, minor yet warlike and immensely ambitious feudal lords, whose history was written with the sword, betrayal, and a constant struggle for land and status. They were known for their violent tempers, a tendency to rebel against their overlords, the Dukes of Aquitaine and Kings of England, and a chronic inability to hold on to the power they seized. However, behind this prosaic history lay a much darker and more romantic legend, whispered by firesides across Europe. The Lusignan family lore was the story of their ancestress, the fairy Melusine. According to the legend, one of the first lords of Lusignan encountered a mysterious and beautiful maiden in the forest, who agreed to be his wife on one condition: he must never see her on a Saturday. She brought him wealth and fame and bore him 10 sons, but all of them had some physical flaw, as if marked by another world. Persuaded by a jealous brother, the lord spied on his wife on a Saturday and saw her in her bath in her true form, a beautiful woman to the waist, and below, a monstrous serpent's tail. By revealing her secret, he condemned her to eternal suffering. With a heart-rending scream, Melusine flew out of the window and, it was believed, had appeared on the walls of the castle of Lusignan ever since, on the eve of the death of one of her descendants, or before a great misfortune. This legend was more than just a fairy tale. It shaped the identity of the lineage. The Lusignans carried a dual heritage. On one hand, the promise of supernatural luck and great achievements, and on the other, the curse of betrayal, exile, and the inevitable loss of all they gained. They were doomed to forever strive for the heights and to forever fall from them. Guy, as one of his father's many sons, inherited this fate in full. In his character, the ambition of Melusine was combined with a fatal inability to foresee the consequences of his actions. He seemed programmed for this cycle of rise and fall, and his entire life would become the most vivid and tragic embodiment of his family's curse. The mystical aura surrounding the Lusignan family was not just folklore. It created certain expectations, and perhaps even served as a kind of psychological justification for their turbulent and contradictory nature. The legend of Melusine, the serpent fairy whose dual nature, half divine, half monstrous, was passed down to her descendants, served as a powerful metaphor for their own destiny. It was a tale less about magic and more about human nature, torn between great aspirations and base passions. The prophecy associated with her foretold that her children and their descendants would found cities, build castles, and rule distant lands, but their success would always be overshadowed by exile and loss. They were marked by fate as eternal wanderers, doomed to seek their kingdom but never to find lasting peace within it. This story, which Guy undoubtedly heard from childhood, could not have failed to influence his worldview. It instilled in him a sense of being chosen, a belief that even as a younger son with no inheritance, he was destined for something greater. At the same time, it carried within it the seed of fatalism, a sense that all fortune is temporary and that every triumph will inevitably be followed by a reckoning. This dualism, a belief in his own destiny and a subconscious expectation of disaster, would become the key to understanding many of his actions. He would act with reckless audacity, as if knowing he was protected by higher powers, while simultaneously displaying a startling lack of foresight, as if he didn't believe he could hold on to what he had gained. Omens of his fate can be seen in more worldly events as well. For example, his exile from Poitou after attacking one of King Henry II of England's noblemen forced him to seek his fortune in the East. This was a literal fulfillment of the prophecy of exile, the first act of a drama that moved him to a stage where the stakes were immeasurably higher. Arriving in the Holy Land, he seemed to bring the shadow of his family's curse with him. His sudden and dizzying rise, his marriage to the heiress to the throne, his coronation. It all looked like supernatural luck, the fulfillment of the legend of Melusine's descendant finding his distant kingdom. But for those who knew the old tales, this triumph was merely the prelude to an inevitable fall, and the question was not if it would happen, but when, and how devastating it would be. The childhood and youth of Guy de Lusignan is the classic story of a younger son in feudal Europe, where the law of primogeniture left everything, land, title, and power, to the eldest brother. For men like Guy, only a few paths were available: take holy orders, become a mercenary, or try to marry a wealthy heiress. Guy had neither a clerical inclination nor, apparently, the outstanding military talents that could have made him a famous commander. His chief assets were his appearance and his lineage. Contemporaries, even his enemies, noted that he was remarkably handsome. Tall, well-built, with regular features, he gave the impression of a noble and important man, even when this exterior was not matched by substance. This natural charisma, this ability to please, especially women, became the tool he used to advance in life. Raised in an atmosphere of constant struggle for status, where every scrap of land and every shred of influence was fiercely contested, he learned the main lesson from an early age: if you are not a predator, you are prey. However, the forge of his character gave him neither the strategic thinking of his father nor the political cunning of his older brothers. He grew up to be a man driven more by emotion than by calculation. His ambitions were vast, but they were not backed by patience or deep intellect. He was impulsive, easily influenced, and prone to making simple decisions in complex situations. His exile from Poitou, after he ambushed and killed Patrick, Earl of Salisbury, speaks volumes. It was an act not of courage but of cowardly revenge, a deed that demonstrated his tendency for impulsive and ill-considered actions. It was this character, forged in the shadow of his elder brothers and under the pressure to make it in life at any cost, that he brought with him to Jerusalem. He arrived not as a pilgrim seeking salvation for his soul, but as an adventurer seeking his fortune. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, with its constant political crises and shortage of noble European suitors, proved to be the perfect environment for him. Here, his handsome appearance and charm were valued more highly than real ability, and his willingness to take risks and bet everything turned out to be the very quality that allowed him to ascend to the very top so quickly and so tragically. The turning point that catapulted the obscure adventurer from Poitou to the pinnacle of power in the Latin East was his marriage to Sibylla, the sister and heiress of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the famous leper king. This event, which took place in 1180, was not just a wedding, but a political earthquake that split the Jerusalem nobility into two irreconcilable camps and predetermined the coming disaster. Sibylla was the key piece in the dynastic game. Widowed after her first marriage, she had a young son, the future King Baldwin IV, and her new husband would automatically become one of the most influential figures in the kingdom, and potentially a future regent or even king. The local barons, led by the powerful Ibelin clan and Raymond of Tripoli, planned to marry her to a major European noble to strengthen ties with the West and bring a strong, experienced ruler to power. However, Sibylla and her mother, Agnes de Courtenay, had their own plans. According to chroniclers, Sibylla was a passionate and strong-willed woman. Upon meeting the handsome and charming Guy, she fell head over heels in love. The romance was swift and secret. While the barons were negotiating with European courts, Sibylla, with the support of her mother and her brother the king, who, weary of political intrigues, gave in to his sister's pleas, made her choice. The wedding was a stunning blow to the peace party. They saw it not just as a misalliance, but as a seizure of power by the court party, a faction of newly arrived adventurers like Reynald de Chatillon and schemers like the master of the Templars, Gerard de Ridefort. To them, Guy was an upstart, an incompetent and easily manipulated foreigner who had become a tool in the hands of more cunning and reckless players. This marriage drew first blood in the invisible civil war that was tearing the kingdom apart. It transformed Guy from an unknown knight into the constable of Jerusalem, regent, and ultimately king. But the price of this ascent was enormous. He gained a crown but lost the support of the most experienced and influential part of the aristocracy. From that moment on, every step he took, every decision he made, was viewed through the prism of this initial schism. He was king to only one half of his kingdom, while the other half saw him as a usurper and a harbinger of doom. This first test, which seemed to him his greatest triumph, was in fact the beginning of his end, laying the foundation for the future defeat at Hattin. Behind the dazzling facade of a royal title and a dizzying rise to power hid a deep, all-consuming fear that was the true engine of all of Guy de Lusignan's actions. It was not just the fear of death or defeat in battle, but something far more existential, a panic-stricken terror of obscurity, of the possibility of once again becoming who he had been, a nobody. His entire life before arriving in the Holy Land had been a series of humiliations and dependent positions. He was a younger son in a family that was itself not at the top of the feudal hierarchy. He lived in the shadow of his more successful brothers, depended on the mercy of lords, and was forced to make his way with flattery and intrigue. This forged in him a deep inferiority complex, which he desperately tried to compensate for with the external trappings of power and status. His secret motivation was not so much the desire to rule or perform great deeds, but the wish to prove to the world, and above all to himself, that he was worth something. The crown of Jerusalem was, for him, not a sacred duty, but the ultimate symbol of personal triumph, proof that he, Guy, had managed to surpass all those who had once looked down on him. This inner demon made him extremely vulnerable to manipulation. Men like Gerard de Ridefort, the master of the Templars, sensed his insecurity perfectly and played on it. When they called caution cowardice and pragmatism treason, they struck his most vulnerable point. Guy could not afford to appear weak or indecisive, because in his own mind, that would mean a return to his former insignificance. That is why he repeatedly made the most radical and reckless decisions that the war party proposed, just to demonstrate his royal will and firmness. His tragedy was that, having obtained everything he could ever have dreamed of, a queen for a wife, a title, power, he never found inner confidence. He remained the same petty Poitevin nobleman, desperately afraid that at any moment he would be exposed and everything would be taken away. It was this fear that made him give the order for the fatal march on Tiberias. He could not bear the accusations of cowardice from Gerard de Riedfort, because those accusations resonated with his own deep-seated complexes. He sacrificed his army and his kingdom not for the sake of faith or strategic necessity, but to silence, for one fateful day, the voice of his inner demon whispering that he was an impostor on the throne. Having received the crown after the death of his young stepson, Baldwin IV, in 1186, Guy de Lusignan found himself in an extremely precarious position. His accession to the throne was the result of a palace coup organized by Sibylla and was met with fierce opposition from the Barons' party, led by Raymond of Tripoli, who had a stronger claim to the regency. Understanding the weakness of his position and lacking the authority or experience to rule independently, Guy did the only thing he could. He completely surrendered himself to the hands of those who had brought him to power. His circle, his strength, became his curse. It was a volatile mix of men whose ambition and fanaticism far exceeded their political wisdom. A key figure in this circle was Raynald de Chatillon, former Prince of Antioch and Lord of Ultra-Jourdain. Raynald was the embodiment of the most unbridled spirit of the Crusades, incredibly brave, charismatic, but also utterly unprincipled, greedy, and cruel. He recognized no treaties or truces with Saladin, believing that raiding and violence were the only proper way to deal with the Saracens. His castle, Kerak, overlooking the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria, was a true robber's nest from which he launched daring raids, plundering rich caravans and violating every existing agreement. Another of Guy's evil geniuses was Gerard de Riedfort, master of the Knights Templar. A man with a dark past, he was said to have joined the order after a personal grievance with Raymond of Tripoli, for whom he harbored a bitter hatred. He was a staunch advocate of aggressive policy, convinced that any concession to the Muslims was a sin and a betrayal of Christ's cause. Wielding enormous influence over the king and controlling one of the kingdom's two strongest armies, Gerard constantly pushed Guy towards confrontation. These men, and others like them, formed an impenetrable cocoon of flattery and radical advice around the king. They played on his insecurity, praising his decisiveness when he followed their instructions and accusing him of cowardice when he showed the slightest hesitation. Experienced and pragmatic barons, like the Ibelins, were pushed away from the court, their warnings ignored. Thus, Guy's strength was illusory. He was a king, but not a ruler. His will was the will of his advisors, and their will was leading the kingdom straight to the abyss. He became a hostage to those he considered his support, and that support proved to be rotten. The short period of Guy de Lusignan's reign, from 1186 to 1187, became the time when the fragile geopolitical balance in the Holy Land was finally and irrevocably shattered. While previous rulers, including the wise leper king Baldwin IV, had tried their utmost to maintain truces with Saladin, understanding the military superiority of the united Muslim world, Guy, pushed by his entourage, pursued a policy of direct escalation. The central figure who blew up the situation was Reynald de Chatillon. In late 1186, in blatant violation of the current truce, he committed his most daring and provocative act. He attacked a huge and wealthy caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. Not only did he seize immense treasures, but he also took many noble people captive, including, according to some sources, Saladin's own sister. This was not just a breach of treaty. It was a public insult that Saladin, as the leader of the Muslim world, could not leave unanswered. He immediately sent envoys to Guy de Lusignan, demanding the return of the loot and the release of the prisoners, as required by the terms of the truce. This was the moment of truth for King Guy. He had a chance to prove himself a statesman, to rein in his uncontrollable vassal and save the peace. However, when he demanded that Reynald comply with the treaty, Reynald arrogantly replied that he was lord in his own land, just as Guy was in his, and was not obliged to obey the king's orders. At this critical moment, Guy displayed his greatest weakness, a lack of political will. He could not, or dared not, force Reynald to submit. His inaction was interpreted by Saladin as a sign of approval for Chatillon's actions and as a declaration of war. Saladin swore a personal oath to behead the treacherous Reynald and began to assemble the greatest army the Levant had ever seen for a holy war, a jihad. All bridges were burned. The policy of provocation encouraged by Guy's court had borne its poisonous fruit. The landscape under his rule changed rapidly. From a state of fragile peace, where dialogue and compromise were still possible, it transformed into a scorched field of preparation for total war. Guy, without realizing it, had helped Saladin achieve his main goal. He had given him an undeniable reason for invasion and had united the entire Muslim world under the banner of sacred vengeance for defiled honor. In the history of military art, the Battle of Hattin is studied not as an example of the victor's brilliant tactics, but primarily as a textbook case of a colossal strategic error made by the loser. And that error lies entirely with Guy de Lusignan and his advisors. In the spring of 1187, Saladin crossed the Jordan and besieged the city of Tiberias, which belonged to the wife of Raymond of Tripoli. This was a cunning move. The Sultan knew that Raymond, a proponent of peace, would demand that the king save his wife's domain, thereby luring the Crusader army into a trap. In response, Guy assembled the largest army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever fielded at Sephoria, near abundant water sources. About 20,000 men, including more than 1,200 heavily armed knights. At a war council held on the night of July 2nd, fierce debates erupted. Raymond of Tripoli, who knew the terrain and Saladin's tactics perfectly, made a desperate speech. He urged the king and the barons to remain at Sephoria. He argued that they had water and provisions, while Saladin's army was suffering from the heat far from any water source. He admitted that Tiberias would likely fall, but it would be a tactical loss, whereas a forced march across 15 miles of scorched, waterless desert under the blazing July sun, all while under constant attack from Saracen light cavalry, was certain suicide. "I would rather lose Tiberias than have you lose the entire kingdom," he concluded. His arguments were so convincing that the council decided to stay put. However, that night, the master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, slipped into the king's tent. Exactly what he said to Guy remains a secret, but chroniclers agree that he played on the king's greatest fear, the accusation of cowardice. He called Raymond's position treason and declared that refusing to march to the aid of the besieged would be an indelible stain on the honor of Christian arms. Giving in to these persuasions, Guy changed his mind. At dawn on July the 3rd, He gave the order that would become his army's death sentence: march on Tiberias. This was not just a tactical miscalculation. It was a violation of every conceivable rule of desert warfare. He voluntarily abandoned his main advantage, water, and led his men into the hell that Saladin had prepared for them. This fateful march became a symbol of his reign, an impulsive, ill-considered decision made under pressure from fanatics and against all common sense, which led to absolute catastrophe. The drama that unfolded before the Battle of Hattin was not merely a clash of two armies, but the culmination of a deep internal conflict that had fractured the kingdom of Jerusalem. On one side of this conflict stood Guy de Lusignan, the king who symbolized the war party. He was surrounded by knights newly arrived from the West, for whom the crusade was an act of pure fanaticism and a search for personal glory. Their worldview was black and white. There were soldiers of Christ, and there were enemies of the faith, and any compromise with the latter was treason. Their chief ideologue was the master of the Templars, Gerard de Ridefort, and their battering ram was the recklessly brave and treacherous Raynald de Chatillon. They did not understand, and did not want to understand, the complexities of Middle Eastern politics, seeing truces and treaties only as signs of weakness. Their strategy was simple: to seek a decisive battle in which, they believed, God would grant victory to the righteous. Guy, being an outsider himself and lacking deep knowledge of the region, became the perfect expression of their ideas. He spoke their language, shared their simplistic worldview, and most importantly, was psychologically dependent on their approval. On the other side stood Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. He was the leader of the party of local barons, or poulains, Franks who were born and raised in the Holy Land. Unlike the newcomers, they knew the region intimately, spoke Arabic, understood the mentality of their neighbors, and were acutely aware of their kingdom's military vulnerability. Raymond was a direct descendant of one of the heroes of the First Crusade, possessed immense authority, and was considered the wisest and most experienced politician in the Levant. He was a proponent of a pragmatic approach, understanding that the kingdom's survival depended not on a single decisive battle, which could easily be lost, but on skillful diplomacy, maintaining truces and exploiting disagreements within the Muslim world. He had even made a separate peace with Saladin to protect his northern domains, an act his enemies immediately branded as treason. This conflict between two leaders and two ideologies was a conflict between fanatical self-confidence and sober calculation, between illusion and reality. Guy was the embodiment of the illusion that a handful of knights could impose their will on the entire East by force. Raymond was the voice of the reality that said the kingdom could only survive if it became a part of that East. On the fateful night before the march to Tiberias, it was not just two tactics that clashed, but two worlds. And the victory of Gerard de Ridefort over the reason of Raymond in King Guy's mind was the victory of illusion over reality, a triumph of pride that led inevitably to ruin. The night of July 2nd to 3rd, 1187, in the Crusader camp by the springs of Sephoria, became the crossroads of fate where a single wrong turn determined the collapse of an entire kingdom. After the daytime war council, where the wisdom of Raymond of Tripoli, who proposed staying put and not walking into Saladin's trap, had seemingly prevailed, the tension did not subside. The air was thick with mutual suspicion and hidden enmity. While the soldiers rested by the life-saving water, the final act of the tragedy was playing out in the royal tent. Gerard de Ridefort, the master of the Templars, could not accept a decision he considered a display of cowardice and a personal insult. He came to Guy when he was alone and used his most powerful and only argument: manipulation. History has not preserved his exact words, but their essence can be easily reconstructed from the consequences. He undoubtedly accused Raymond of outright treason, reminding Guy of his separate peace with Saladin. He portrayed Raymond's advice as a cunning ploy to surrender the kingdom to the enemy and seize power for himself. Then, he targeted Guy's most vulnerable point, his royal honor. He painted pictures of shame. The Christian city of Tiberias fallen, its defenders slaughtered, its women violated, all because the king of Jerusalem, the leader of Christ's army, was too afraid to leave his camp. He probably asked, "What will the Pope say? What will all of Christendom say when they learn that the Templars and Hospitallers were ready for battle, but their king preferred to sit by a stream?" This was a blow below the belt, aimed directly at the heart of an insecure monarch. Guy found himself facing a dilemma that was, for him, unsolvable. To listen to Raymond meant trusting a man whom his entire party considered an enemy, and worse, admitting he was wrong and appearing weak in the eyes of his most loyal supporters. To listen to Gerard meant taking a huge military risk, but saving face, showing royal resolve, and asserting his authority. For a man whose power was so fragile and whose self-esteem was so vulnerable, the choice was predetermined. He chose not to save his army, but to save his reputation in the eyes of the hawks. He sacrificed strategy for the sake of image. The moment he overturned the wise decision of the council and gave the order to prepare for a morning march, he crossed his Rubicon. It was his personal moment of choice, and he chose the path that led to glory in his own imagination, but which, in reality, was the road to the catastrophe of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem. The dawn of July 3rd, 1187, found the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem on the move. It was a grand and terrifying spectacle, the apex of Frankish power in the east. Picture the scene. More than 1,200 knights in chainmail and helmets gleaming in the sun, their lances topped with colorful pennons. The banners of the great baronial houses and the orders of the Templars and Hospitallers flying above them. In the center of the army, under the guard of an elite detachment, they carried the greatest relic of the Christian world, the true cross, encrusted with gold and precious stones. Behind the knightly cavalry followed thousands of infantry, crossbowmen, spearmen, militia. The total strength of the army reached 20,000 men. Never before had the kingdom gathered such a force in one place. In that morning hour, looking at this seemingly invincible avalanche of steel and banners, Guy de Lusignan must have felt an intoxicating sense of power and confidence. He had made his choice. He had rejected Raymond's cowardly advice and was leading the army of Christ into battle, as befitted a true Crusader king. This was his moment of pride, the Greek hubris in its purest form. He had thrown down a challenge not only to Saladin, but to nature itself, to the very logic of war. He believed that the sheer force of a knightly charge and the divine protection of the true cross would be enough to crush any enemy. At that moment, he and his comrades were blinded by their own strength, certain of their divine election and invincibility. They did not see that their brilliant army was like a beautiful flower, torn from the soil and doomed to wither under the scorching sun. They had voluntarily left their only source of life, water, and embarked on a journey through hell. Saladin, watching their advance from the surrounding hills, could not believe his luck. He saw his enemy making the very mistake he had so hoped for. He didn't even need to fight a major battle. All that was required was to let the desert, thirst, and the Crusaders' own folly do most of the work for him. The peak of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's power, turned out to be the prelude to its agony, and its king's moment of greatest pride became the beginning of his greatest humiliation. The movement of the huge, cumbersome Crusader army across the scorched plain quickly transformed from a triumphal march into a funeral procession. The first cracks in their self-confidence appeared just a few hours after leaving Sepphoria. The July Palestinian sun was at its zenith, turning the knight's armor into scorching ovens. Dust, kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves, choked their lungs and covered everything in a gray film. But the most terrifying enemy was thirst. The water supplies the soldiers carried were rapidly dwindling, and there was not a single well or stream along the entire route to the Sea of Galilee. Saladin, meanwhile, was not idle. He unleashed upon the Frankish army a tactic that had been perfected by nomads. Light horse archers, like swarms of angry wasps, circled the slowly crawling column, showering it with clouds of arrows and immediately retreating at any attempt to counterattack. These stings were not so much lethal as they were exhausting. They forced the knights to constantly maintain formation, allowing not a moment of rest, and sowed panic among the infantry in the rearguard. To this was added another agonizing element of psychological warfare. The Saracens set fire to the dry scrub and grass on both sides of the army's path. Thick, acrid smoke enveloped the Crusaders, making it difficult to breathe, causing coughing, and further intensifying their already unbearable thirst. By evening, the army was completely demoralized. Soldiers were collapsing from heat stroke, their tongues swollen, their cries for water growing louder. Discipline began to break down. The infantry, desperately seeking salvation, began to separate from the cavalry, disrupting the battle formation. It became clear that reaching Tiberias that day was impossible. Guy was forced to order a halt for the night on a waterless plateau near two hills known as the Horns of Hattin. This decision was tantamount to signing a death warrant. The army was trapped, surrounded on all sides by Saladin's forces, without a single drop of water and with no hope of rescue. The storm clouds had become the storm itself. What had seemed an invincible force in the morning had, by night, become a gathering of tormented, thirst-crazed men awaiting their terrible fate. The agony of the army trapped on the Horns of Hattin reached its peak at dawn on the 4th of July. The night brought no relief. On the contrary, it was filled with the mocking shouts of the Saracens, who prayed with taunting loudness, beat drums, and described to their thirst-tormented enemies the coolness of the water in the lake, visible in the distance. In the morning, as the sun once again began its deadly journey across the sky, Guy de Lusignan and his barons realized they had only two choices left: die of thirst and arrows where they stood, or attempt the impossible, to break through to the Sea of Galilee. It was at this moment of desperation that the order was given for the final, fateful act of this drama. The king, along with a small contingent of the most desperate knights, attempted a charge from the hill, hoping to punch a hole in the encirclement. This was no longer a tactical maneuver. It was a gesture of pure despair, the death throe of a great army. Raymond of Tripoli and his contingent also charged in a different direction. Saladin, brilliantly managing the battle, ordered his warriors to part before Raymond's force, allowing it to escape the ring, but immediately closed ranks behind him, cutting him off from the main army. Perhaps it was a sign of respect for an old foe, or perhaps a cold calculation to deprive the army of its most experienced commander. The main attack, led by Guy himself, faltered almost immediately. The exhausted horses could not build up speed, and the weakened knights were easy targets for the countless enemies. The infantry, having lost all organization, either surrendered or tried to scramble up the hill in a futile attempt to find safety. The climax of the battle came when the Saracens captured the king's tent and the main relic, the true cross. The loss of the cross was a crushing moral blow to the Christians. It was seen as a sign that God had abandoned them. After that, resistance ceased completely. Guy de Lusignan, along with the surviving barons, including Reynald de Châtillon and Gérard de Riedfort, found himself in a tight circle of enemies. They had no choice but to surrender. This turning point, this last desperate charge, became the final chord in the symphony of errors that began with the decision to leave Seforia. It turned a defeat into a complete and utter rout, which wiped the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the face of the earth and delivered the holy city into the hands of Saladin. King Guy's capture at Hattin did not end the political games in the remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. On the contrary, it elevated them to a new, even more bitter level. While Guy was held in honorable but humiliating captivity in Damascus, where Saladin treated him with chivalrous courtesy, a desperate struggle for survival and power unfolded on the narrow coastal strip still under Frankish control. The figure who came to the forefront in this chaos was Conrad of Montferrat, the Lord of Tyre. He was Guy's complete opposite, an experienced warrior who had fought in numerous wars in Italy and Byzantium, a cunning and ruthless politician possessed of an unbendable will. He had arrived in the Holy Land just days before the Battle of Hattin, and by a stroke of luck found himself in Tyre, the only major port city that Saladin could not take immediately. Conrad promptly took command of the defense, displaying miraculous courage and organizational talent. He repelled several assaults, fortified the walls, and turned the city into an impregnable fortress that became a symbol of resistance and hope for all surviving Christians. His heroic defense of Tyre quickly made him the most popular and respected leader in the eyes of those who remained. In this situation, the figure of the captive King Guy became not a symbol of unity, but a source of discord. Conrad and his supporters, including the powerful Ibelin clan, openly declared that Guy, through his inept command, had destroyed the kingdom and forfeited all rights to the throne. They refused to recognize his authority and acted as independent rulers. For them, Conrad was the savior, and Guy was the author of the catastrophe. The internal struggle flared up with renewed intensity. Guy's supporters, though few, tried to defend his rights, citing the legitimacy of his coronation. But their voices were drowned out by a chorus of accusations. Queen Sibylla herself, who was in Ascalon and then Jerusalem before its surrender, lost all influence. Thus, while Guy was in captivity, his kingdom not only shrank to a few cities, but also effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. It split into two camps that fiercely hated each other. This internal division was perhaps an even more terrible consequence of Hattin than the military defeat itself. It paralyzed the Franks' will to resist and created the perfect conditions for Saladin's further conquests. The release of Guy de Lusignan from captivity in the summer of 1188 was one of Saladin's most mysterious and far-sighted political moves. At first glance, it was an act of chivalrous magnanimity. The Sultan made Guy swear an oath never to take up arms against him again and then let him go, seemingly to the four winds. However, behind this gesture was a brilliant and cynical calculation. Saladin, being not only a great commander but also a master psychologist and politician, understood perfectly what was happening in his enemy's camp. He knew that Conrad of Montferrat had successfully united the remaining Crusader forces around him in Tyre and had become a real and dangerous leader of the resistance. Conrad was intelligent, decisive, and commanded universal respect. To leave him as the sole leader of the Franks would have meant allowing them to consolidate and create a new, albeit small, but strong state. Reintroducing Guy de Lusignan into the game completely changed this equation. Saladin understood that Guy was a weak, incompetent figure, and most importantly, utterly hated by the party of Conrad and the Ibelins. By setting him free, the Sultan was not showing mercy. He was throwing a lit fuse into the powder keg of the Frankish camp. He knew that Guy, with his obsession to reclaim his legitimate title, would immediately start a power struggle with Conrad. This would inevitably lead to a renewal of internal strife, to a schism that would paralyze the Christians and prevent them from organizing effective resistance. And Saladin's calculation paid off perfectly. As soon as Guy was released, he immediately declared himself the still legitimate king and demanded that command be handed over to him. This began an inexorable movement toward a new denouement, a new round of civil war among those who were already standing on the brink of ruin. Thus, Guy's release was not the end of his humiliations, but merely the beginning of a new stage. Saladin used him as his most effective political weapon, turning the hapless king into a virus that was meant to destroy the already weakened organism of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from within. Freed from captivity, Guy de Lusignan, accompanied by a small retinue of loyal knights, made his way to Tyre, the last bastion of Christian resistance, a city that had become synonymous with the courage of its defender, Conrad of Montferrat. Guy likely believed naively that as the legitimate king, he would be joyfully received by his subjects and immediately handed the reins of power. The reality was far more brutal and humiliating. When he approached the gates of Tyre, he was met not with open arms, but with a lowered portcullis and aimed crossbows. Conrad of Montferrat, standing on the walls, coldly and decisively refused to let him into the city. Conrad's reasoning was devastatingly logical and had the full support of the citizens and the garrison. He declared that Guy de Lusignan, through his incompetence, had lost the kingdom at Hattin, and according to feudal law, had forfeited all rights to the crown. Tyre, he said, had been entrusted to him by God and its inhabitants for its defense, and he had no intention of handing it over to the man who had already lost everything once. For Guy, this was a blow more terrible than captivity. He, the king of Jerusalem, was an outcast, with no place even in the last sliver of his own kingdom. This was the absolute bottom, the zenith of his fall. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, and now a ruler barred from his only remaining city. For several weeks he camped with his small entourage outside the walls of Tyre, appealing in vain to justice and law, but no one listened. His presence inspired not sympathy but contempt and irritation. He had become a living reminder of the greatest shame, of the catastrophe for which everyone held him responsible. This public humiliation before his chief rival could have broken anyone. Anyone else in his place would probably have given up, gone into exile, or tried to return to Europe. But it was at this moment of complete despair that a quality emerged in Guy's character that no one had noticed before. A dull, irrational, but indestructible stubbornness. He was a failure, but he was not a man who knew how to give up. And this stubbornness, this inability to accept his defeat, would soon compel him to take an action that seemed an act of pure madness, but which would, in the end, completely change his destiny. Faced with the closed gates of Tyre and the contempt of Conrad of Montferrat, Guy de Lusignan found himself in a hopeless situation. He was completely discredited, with no army, no money, and no support. His political career in the Holy Land seemed to be over. And it was then, at this point of absolute zero, that he made a decision that historians to this day regard as either an act of brilliant audacity or a gesture of utter desperation. Instead of leaving, he decided to go all in, gathering the handful of knights who remained loyal to him, perhaps a few hundred men, and a small contingent of newly arrived Pisans. In August of 1189, he did the unthinkable. He marched south and laid siege to Acre. At that time, Acre was the largest, wealthiest, and most well-fortified port in Palestine, held by Saladin with a powerful garrison. The idea of besieging such a fortress with a force several times smaller than the garrison itself seemed absurd and suicidal. Everyone, including Saladin and Conrad, saw it as a final, pointless gesture of a doomed man. However, this desperate gambit proved to be surprisingly effective. First, it was completely unexpected by Saladin, who could not imagine anyone would dare such an adventure. Second, and most importantly, Guy created a new rallying point for the Christian world. Until then, the small contingents of crusaders and pilgrims arriving from the west had no clear objective. Tyre was closed and controlled by Conrad, who was in no hurry to share power. But now they had a banner to rally under, the banner of the legitimate, albeit unlucky, King of Jerusalem, who, against all odds, was fighting the infidels. Guy's camp outside the walls of Acre, initially small and vulnerable, began to grow steadily. Newly arrived knights, adventurers, and common soldiers flocked to him, for whom the siege became a symbol of a new crusade. With this single move, Guy completely changed the strategic situation. He seized the initiative from Conrad, transforming himself from an exile into the leader of a new pan-Christian cause. He was no longer begging to be let into a city. He was creating his own city under the walls of an enemy fortress. This act, born of desperation, demonstrated an astonishing trait in his character. In moments of total collapse, he was capable of illogical but uniquely correct actions that opened up new possibilities when it seemed none were left. Guy de Lusignan's small camp under the walls of Acre, which at first seemed a suicidal venture, by the will of history became the epicenter of one of the most dramatic and bloody events of the Crusades. The siege of Acre, lasting almost 2 years from August 1189 to July 1191, became a giant crucible into which history threw the best warriors of the Christian and Muslim worlds. Gradually, news that the King of Jerusalem was besieging Saladin's great port spread throughout Europe, becoming a powerful call to action. From all corners of Christendom, ships with reinforcements began to stream to Acre: French, English, Germans, Flemings, Italians. The Crusader camp swelled, turning into a vast, noisy, multinational city of tents and temporary fortifications. But Saladin did not stand aside. He brought his main army and surrounded the Crusader camp, thus creating a unique double siege situation. The Christians were besieging the Muslims in Acre, while Saladin's Muslims were besieging the Christian camp from the outside. This turned the struggle for the city into a prolonged war of attrition, filled with brutal battles, sorties, assaults, famine, and disease. For Guy de Lusignan, this siege became the finest hour of his stubbornness. Lacking the talents of a great commander, he proved to be an incredibly resilient and tenacious leader. He personally participated in the fighting, maintained the morale of his soldiers, and most importantly, legitimized the entire enterprise by his very presence. He was the banner under which all forces gathered. Even his rival, Conrad of Montferrat, was eventually forced to join the siege, unwilling to remain on the sidelines of the main event. In this boiling crucible, fates were melted down and reforged. It was here that Queen Sibylla and her two young daughters died of disease, stripping Guy of his main legal claim to the throne, the right of a queen's husband. It was also here that he showed the world that despite the defeat at Hattin, he had been written off too soon. He was no longer just the chief failure. He had become the symbol of unyielding resistance, the man who single-handedly began the endeavor that would become the prelude to the Great Third Crusade. The epic siege of Acre, started by a desperate, exiled king, reached its climax in 1191 with the arrival of the two most powerful monarchs of Western Europe, King Philip II Augustus of France and King Richard I of England, who went down in history as the Lionheart. Their appearance with large, well-equipped armies drastically shifted the balance of power and turned the protracted war of attrition into the final act of a grand drama. For Guy de Lusignan himself, however, this event had dual consequences. On one hand, the arrival of the kings guaranteed the swift fall of Acre, which would be his personal triumph, as he was the one who had started the siege. On the other hand, he instantly ceased to be the central figure on the stage. From the leader of the pan-Christian army, he was transformed into a junior partner, a petitioner whose fate now depended entirely on the will and political interests of these two powerful and feuding titans. The political game immediately became more complex. Philip Augustus, always seeking an opportunity to weaken his main rival, the King of England, who as Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine was his vassal, immediately backed Conrad of Montferrat. Conrad was a relative of the French king, an experienced and cunning politician, and supporting his candidacy for the throne of Jerusalem was a way for Philip to strengthen French influence in the region. Richard the Lionheart, in contrast, took Guy de Lusignan under his protection. The reasons for this were more feudal and personal than political. The Lusignans were Richard's vassals in Poitou, and to support his own vassal against a candidate backed by his enemy Philip was a matter of honor and principle for Richard. Thus, the dispute over who should be king of Jerusalem, the incompetent but legitimate Guy or the heroic but usurping Conrad, became one of the battlegrounds in the global confrontation between England and France. Guy himself was cast as a pawn in this great game. His personal qualities, his past defeat at Hattin, and his persistence at Acre all faded into the background. His fate was no longer being decided on the battlefield, but in the tents of kings, where intrigues were woven and deals were made that had little to do with the Holy Land and much to do with European politics. The fall of Acre in July 1191, after a nearly 2-year siege, was the greatest Crusader victory since the conquest of Jerusalem. It was a triumph for which Guy de Lusignan had every reason to claim his share of the credit. However, immediately after the victory, the question of the future of the king and the kingdom arose with new, even greater urgency. The dispute between the supporters of Guy and those of Conrad, fueled by the rivalry between Richard and Philip, threatened to escalate into open-armed conflict within the Christian camp. To resolve this crisis, an assembly of barons and leaders of the crusade was convened. The decision they reached was, for Guy de Lusignan, a second crushing defeat after Hattin, this time a political one. By an overwhelming majority, Conrad of Montferrat was elected king of Jerusalem. The arguments in his favor were undeniable. He was an experienced warrior, a talented diplomat. He had saved Tyre, and he enjoyed the support of most of the local nobility and the French king. Against this backdrop, Guy, stained by the defeat at Hattin, appeared a weak and undesirable figure. Moreover, with the death of his wife Sibylla and their daughters during the siege, he had lost his main legal claim to the throne. He was no longer the queen's husband. He was simply a widower. Richard the Lionheart, despite all his personal support for Guy, was forced to yield to the will of the majority to preserve the unity of the Crusader army. However, he managed to secure a compromise for his protégé. Guy would retain the royal title for life, but after his death, the crown would pass to Conrad and his heirs. Additionally, as compensation, Guy was given lordship over the coastal cities of Jaffa and Ascalon. This decision was a profound humiliation for Guy. He, who had started the siege of Acre and led the crusade to its first great victory, was ultimately sidelined from his main goal, reclaiming the crown. He had lost for a second time, and this time not to a Muslim enemy, but to his Christian rival. His persistence and resilience had brought victory to the common cause, but not to him personally. He was once again cast in the role of a failure, the man who does all the dirty work while others reap the benefits. It seemed his destiny was one of perpetual loss, and that this time his fall was final and irrevocable. History, however, was preparing another, most unexpected and bloody, twist in this tangled drama. Just days after his election as king, on April the 28th, 1192, Conrad of Montferrat, at the very peak of his triumph, was murdered on the streets of Tyre. Two assassins, believed to have been sent by the leader of the Nizari sect, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, fatally wounded him with daggers. The assassination plunged the Christian camp into shock and gave rise to numerous conspiracy theories. Many, especially the French, immediately accused Richard the Lionheart of orchestrating the murder, believing he had cleared the way for his own candidate. Although no direct evidence was ever found, the suspicion long tarnished the English king's reputation. Conrad's sudden death created a power vacuum and seemed to open a new window of opportunity for Guy de Lusignan. His chief rival was dead, and he, according to previous agreements, could have reasserted his claim to the throne. However, fate dealt him a third, and this time final, political blow. The leaders of the crusade, seeking to stabilize the situation as quickly as possible, acted fast. Just a few days after the murder, Conrad's widow, Isabella, who was the rightful heiress to the Jerusalem throne, was married to the nephew of both Richard and Philip Augustus, the young and energetic Count Henry of Champagne. This marriage immediately made Henry the new king of Jerusalem. The move was a political masterstroke. It satisfied both the English and French parties, brought a strong and noble lord to power, and definitively closed the question of Guy de Lusignan's rights. For Guy, this was the final defeat. He had lost his wife, lost his kingdom, been passed over in 2 elections, and was now completely pushed out of the struggle for the Jerusalem crown. He had become a political ghost, a king without a throne, whose presence in the Holy Land was now pointless and even burdensome for everyone. Any hope of regaining power was lost. He had lost everything for a third time, and now there was nothing left for him but to accept his fate and leave the stage. It was at this moment of complete and final fiasco that Richard the Lionheart, feeling a certain responsibility for the fate of his loyal, albeit extremely unlucky vassal, made a move that would change the history of the Mediterranean. Richard needed to solve the Guy problem, to reward him for his loyalty, compensate him for the loss of his crown, and just as importantly, remove him from the political stage of the Holy Land, where he was a constant source of instability. The solution came in the form of the island of Cyprus. A year earlier, in 1191, on his way to the Holy Land, Richard's fleet was caught in a storm, and several ships, including the one carrying his fiancée Berengaria of Navarre and his sister Joan, were shipwrecked on the coast of Cyprus. The island was then ruled by a self-proclaimed emperor, Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine aristocrat who had broken away from Constantinople. He treated the shipwrecked party harshly, effectively taking them prisoner. In response, an enraged Richard landed on the island, defeated Isaac's forces in a swift and brilliant campaign, captured Isaac himself, and proclaimed himself ruler of Cyprus. However, the island was more of a burden than a valuable asset for Richard. His main goal was the Holy Land, and he needed money to continue the war with Saladin. So he sold Cyprus to the Knights Templar for 100,000 Byzants. But the Templars' rule on the island was short-lived and brutal. They imposed exorbitant taxes on the local Greek population, sparking a bloody uprising. Realizing that holding the island would be too costly, the Templars gladly agreed to return it to Richard, getting back part of their payment, and rid themselves of the troublesome asset. And it was then that Richard had a brilliant idea. He offered to sell the lordship of Cyprus to Guy de Lusignan for the remaining sum owed by the Templars. For Guy, this was a salvation. Having lost everything on the mainland, he was given the chance to acquire his own domain, even if it was an island that many considered a backwater province. He agreed. This act, which to contemporaries seemed little more than an honorable exile, a way to get rid of a bothersome failure, became a turning point. It was the moment when the greatest failure of the Crusades, the man who lost the most sacred kingdom in Christendom, unwittingly stepped onto the path of founding his own, far more durable kingdom. Having moved to Cyprus in 1192, Guy de Lusignan, the man whose name was synonymous with disaster on the mainland, finally found a stage where his modest talents were in demand and his flaws were not critical. Here, far from the great battles for Jerusalem and the complex intrigues of the royal court, the most unexpected and ironic final chapter of his life unfolded. The Cyprus he received was a land with a rich history, but with disorganized governance and a discontented Greek population, still reeling from the brutal suppression of their rebellion by the Templars. Guy approached the task of governing the island with a pragmatism he had so sorely lacked in Jerusalem. His main task was to consolidate his power and create a reliable base of support. And he found a solution that was brilliant in its simplicity. He sent messengers throughout the Levant, appealing to all the Frankish knights who had lost their lands after Saladin's conquests. He offered them what they craved most: land. He divided the island into feudal fiefs and began distributing them to landless barons, knights, and even common soldiers in exchange for an oath of vassalage. This move was a colossal success. A stream of settlers from the remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem poured into Cyprus, creating a new ruling class on the island, a Frankish aristocracy. In a short time, Guy had established a classic Western-style feudal system on Cyprus. He did not try to upend local Greek customs, allowing the Orthodox population to live by their own laws, but all military and political power was now concentrated in the hands of his vassals. He laid the foundation for a unique society where French knightly culture existed alongside ancient Greco-Byzantine civilization. For the first time in his life, Guy didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He was the supreme lord, his authority unquestioned. He didn't need to bow to the hawks or fear accusations of cowardice. He could calmly and methodically engage in state-building. The irony of fate was that in losing the sacred crown of Jerusalem, he gained real power and the opportunity to build something from scratch. The honorable exile with which Richard had rewarded him turned out to be the greatest gift, allowing a failure to become a founder. Guy de Lusignan's journey ended in 1194 in Nicosia, the new capital of his Cypriot domain. He died relatively young, just 2 years after setting foot on the island that became his final refuge and his greatest achievement. His death was quiet, a stark contrast to the turbulent and humiliating life he had lived on the mainland. He departed this life not as a prisoner in Saladin's tent, not as an exile at the gates of Tyre, and not as a humbled petitioner in the camp of kings, but as a sovereign ruler, a lord who had laid the foundations of a new state. Interestingly, he never formally wore the crown of Cyprus. He ruled the island as Lord of Cyprus. It was his brother and heir, Amalric de Lusignan, who would receive the official royal title from the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, transforming the lordship into the Kingdom of Cyprus. However, it was Guy who was the true founder of this kingdom. He was the Moses who led his people, the landless Frankish knights, out of the desert of defeat and into a promised land. His death closed the remarkable circle of his fate. The man who had so desperately clung to the royal title in Jerusalem found his true calling by effectively renouncing it and focusing on the real work of governance. His is a story of how the greatest defeat can become the starting point for the greatest success. He lost the main battle of his life, but won the war for historical immortality, albeit in a completely unexpected form. His body was buried in the Church of the Templars in Nicosia, and his grave became the symbol of the birth of a new dynasty, one forged not from the glory of victories, but from the ashes of catastrophe. The end of his journey was not tragic, but rather ironically triumphant. The greatest failure of the Crusades died having created a legacy that proved to be surprisingly strong and durable. The legacy of Guy de Lusignan, viewed through the centuries, presents a stunning historical paradox. In popular history, in chronicles and novels, his name is forever linked to the catastrophe at Hattin. He is the symbol of incompetence, the failed king, the man whose fault it was that Jerusalem fell. This part of his legacy is undeniable and serves as an eternal lesson about how a ruler's personal weaknesses can lead to the downfall of an entire state. However, there is another, far more substantial and lasting legacy that is often forgotten. The Lusignan dynasty he founded on Cyprus ruled the island for nearly 300 years, from 1192 to 1489. For a short time, they also ruled what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Over these 3 centuries, the Kingdom of Cyprus grew into a prosperous and wealthy center of the Christian world in the eastern Mediterranean. After the final fall of Acre in 1291, Cyprus remained the last Crusader stronghold in the region. Its capitals, Nicosia and Famagusta, became major trading hubs where the paths between Europe, the Middle East, and Egypt converged. Venetian and Genoese merchants conducted their business here, bringing immense wealth to the island. The architecture of Cyprus was enriched with magnificent Gothic cathedrals, rivaling those in France, which still capture the imagination of tourists today. The island's culture was a unique synthesis of French chivalric traditions, Byzantine heritage, and Italian mercantile spirit. This kingdom outlasted all of its great contemporaries. It outlasted the Ayyubid dynasty founded by its conqueror, Saladin. It outlasted the Mamluk state that crushed the last Crusader holdings on the mainland. It existed longer than many feudal kingdoms in Europe itself. And all this splendor, this 300-year history of stability and prosperity, grew from a single act, the purchase of an island by a disgraced, failed king. Thus, a look at Guy de Lusignan through the ages reveals the duality of his figure. In the history of the Holy Land, he is a destroyer, but in the history of Cyprus, he is a creator, and his creative legacy proved to be immeasurably more enduring than what he had destroyed. We can now provide the final answer to the central question. How did the greatest failure of the Crusades create a dynasty that lasted for 300 years? The solution to this paradox is that Guy de Lusignan achieved his greatest success not in spite of his failures, but precisely because of them. His story is a perfect example of the dialectic of defeat, where a negative multiplied by a negative yields a positive. Let's break down this formula. First, his catastrophic defeat at Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem completely wiped out his political capital on the mainland. He became such a toxic and undesirable figure that the barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem unhesitatingly rejected his candidacy twice in favor of stronger leaders. Had he been merely a mediocre, but not a disastrous king, he might have been left on the throne and would have shared the sad fate of his ephemeral kingdom. But it was the totality of his failure that made him free for other opportunities. Second, his astonishing, almost irrational persistence, demonstrated during the siege of Acre, made him a valuable vassal in the eyes of Richard the Lionheart. By launching a suicidal siege, Guy created a beachhead for the Third Crusade, rendering Richard an invaluable service. This transformed him from a mere failure into a failure to whom a debt was owed. Richard could not simply abandon a man who had fought so tenaciously for the common cause and was his vassal. The need to reward him somehow arose. Third, his final removal from the Jerusalem throne created a political problem that needed solving. And it was at this moment that all the pieces of the puzzle came together. Cyprus, recently conquered by Richard and proving to be a troublesome asset for him, became the perfect solution. Selling the island to Guy allowed Richard to simultaneously reward a loyal vassal, get rid of him by removing him from the main political stage, and raise money. For Guy, it was a lifeline. Thus, his dynasty was born from a chain of negative events. Defeat led to the need to find a new purpose. Persistence in that new purpose created a debt of honor with his patron, and the final political fiasco made it necessary to find compensation for him. He received Cyprus not because he was a great conqueror or a wise ruler, but because he was a great failure whose problem needed to be elegantly solved. And this honorable exile turned out to be the foundation for 3 centuries of prosperity. The story of Guy de Lusignan, which at first glance seems to be just the biography of one of many medieval adventurers, is in fact a profound parable about the relativity of success and failure. It teaches us that the historical process is not linear, and a person's fate is often determined not by their most resounding victories, but by how they handle their most crushing defeats. We are accustomed to measuring greatness by the yardstick of obvious achievements: conquered empires, battles won, laws enacted. From this perspective, Guy is an absolute anti-hero, a man whose reign in Jerusalem was a brief prelude to catastrophe. However, his story forces us to look deeper and ask the question, what is true success? Is it fleeting glory or a lasting legacy? Guy lost the greatest prize of his time, the holy city of Jerusalem, a symbol of faith for the entire Christian world. But this loss freed him from the burden of holy war, from the need to constantly fight for survival in a hostile land. Instead, he got the opportunity to become a creator on a blank slate, to build a feudal state from scratch that, protected by the sea, was able to flourish for centuries. His story is a lesson in the power of the second chance. Fate knocked him down time and again, but each time he hit bottom, he found the strength not to give up, but to make one more, albeit desperate, attempt. This was not a manifestation of genius, but rather of simple animalistic stubbornness, an unwillingness to accept the role of a victim. And in the end, it was this quality, not strategic talent or political wisdom, that allowed him to write his family's name into history. The philosophical lesson of his life can be summarized as follows. Sometimes, to build something eternal, you must first lose everything you hold most dear. The story of Guy de Lusignan is a hymn to unpredictability, a reminder that the most enduring dynasties can grow from the soil of the most bitter defeats, and that even the greatest failure can leave behind a legacy that 300 years cannot erase.